Russia and China share a complex history marked by rivalry and territorial disputes. During the Soviet era, the two countries had serious ideological and border conflicts. Although those disputes have largely been resolved, mutual distrust lingers. Russia controls vast resources and sparsely populated lands in Siberia and the Russian Far East, territories that China might eye due to its own growing population and need for resources. If China's geopolitical ambitions expand, this region could become a source of contention. China's economy is exponentially larger and more diversified than Russia's. While Russia remains dependent on exporting raw materials like oil, gas, and minerals, China has become a global manufacturing powerhouse. This economic disparity creates a power imbalance in their relationship, with Russia increasingly relying on China for trade, especially as Western sanctions over Ukraine have forced Moscow to look eastward. China's dominance in trade is also evident in projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which heavily involves Central Asia, historically considered part of Russia's sphere of influence. China's investments in this region could lead to economic dependence, further undermining Russia's influence there. While Russia has maintained a strong military presence, China's military capabilities are catching up rapidly, with increasing investments in high-tech weaponry, naval forces, and artificial intelligence. China's advances in military technology could eventually challenge Russia's dominance in the Eurasian region. Moreover, China's growing technological capabilities in areas like cybersecurity, space, and artificial intelligence give it an edge in modern warfare, where Russia lags behind. Central Asia is a region of strategic importance for both Russia and China. For Russia, Central Asia has historically been within its sphere of influence, part of the post-Soviet space. China, however, has increasingly been investing in infrastructure, trade, and political ties with these nations. This creates competition, as China slowly becomes the dominant power in the region, effectively eroding Russia's influence. Additionally, China's investments in energy pipelines from Central Asia reduce its dependence on Russian energy, further marginalizing Russia in a region where it once had unparalleled dominance. While Russia supplies China with a significant amount of its energy, particularly gas, China has been diversifying its energy sources. It imports oil from the Middle East, gas from Central Asia, and even invests in renewable energy to reduce its reliance on Russian exports. Over time, this reduces Russia's leverage over China in energy negotiations, and Russia risks becoming overly dependent on China as a buyer without reciprocal benefits. China's population is about 10 times larger than Russia's, and this demographic pressure is acutely felt in Russia's sparsely populated Far East. While China is not overtly pushing its people to migrate into Russian territory, the sheer population disparity could eventually make China more assertive over the management of border regions. Some fear that Chinese economic influence in these areas could lead to de facto control, as Chinese businesses invest in Siberian resources and Chinese workers settle there. China's global ambitions, exemplified through projects like the BRI and its growing influence in the United Nations and other global institutions, show that China seeks to become the dominant global power. As China's economic and military power grows, it could increasingly view Russia not as a partner, but as a competitor or even an obstacle to its objectives, particularly in areas like the Arctic, where Russia currently has the upper hand but where China has growing interests. In the long run, it's also possible that Western countries may seek to re-engage with China, offering it a strategic partnership that sidelines Russia. If the West and China were to reconcile their trade disputes or geopolitical differences, China might no longer need Russia as a partner against Western pressure. This would leave Russia isolated, with fewer allies and little leverage, thus turning China into a geopolitical competitor. China is not just advancing in military terms, but also in technology, including artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and 5G. China's technological dominance could pose a threat to Russia's security infrastructure, especially in cybersecurity and information warfare. In the long run, Russia's relatively weaker technological position could make it more vulnerable to Chinese espionage or even cyber attacks. Russia's growing dependence on China, especially after Western sanctions, makes it vulnerable. China holds the economic upper hand, and while the two countries currently cooperate, China can afford to dictate terms due to its economic power. If the balance of power tips too far in China's favor, Russia might find itself in a subservient position, reliant on China for trade, investment, and diplomatic support, while receiving little in return. While Russia and China currently maintain a strategic partnership, primarily united by their opposition to Western hegemony, the long-term prospects are more uncertain. Historical distrust, economic imbalances, strategic competition in Central Asia, and China's rising military and technological superiority create potential fault lines. These issues could eventually turn China into a much larger threat to Russia than the West, especially if China decides to exert its influence over regions or markets traditionally dominated by Russia. In contrast, Russia's economy is much smaller, with a GDP of around $2.22 trillion in 2022. It relies heavily on natural resource exports, particularly oil and gas, which make up a significant portion of its revenue. This reliance on energy exports makes Russia vulnerable to global price fluctuations and sanctions, limiting its economic flexibility. Since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Western nations have imposed strict economic sanctions on Russia. These sanctions have stifled its economy, making it harder for Russia to attract foreign investment or trade outside its energy sector. Russia's military remains powerful, particularly in terms of nuclear weapons, and it continues to be a key military actor. However, its conventional forces have shown limitations during conflicts like the war in Ukraine, where logistical and organizational challenges have become evident. Russia has focused more on regional conflicts, such as in Ukraine and Syria, rather than projecting global power. Russia, on the other hand, lags behind in technological and industrial development. While it has a strong tradition in aerospace, military technology, and space exploration, it has not diversified its economy sufficiently to compete in emerging tech fields. Russia has tried to develop a digital economy and boost its tech sector, but progress has been limited by brain drain, sanctions, and a lack of domestic innovation infrastructure. Russia's geopolitical strategy under President Vladimir Putin has been more focused on protecting its regional sphere of influence, particularly in former Soviet states. However, this strategy has resulted in conflicts, e.g., Ukraine, that have isolated Russia from the West, limiting its ability to influence global affairs in the same way China does. China's rapid economic growth has been the foundation of its rise to global power. Since its economic reforms in the late 20th century, China has become the world's second-largest economy, with significant global trade networks and manufacturing capabilities. Its GDP was around $18 trillion in 2022, with a strong focus on both exports and domestic growth. It has been able to lift hundreds of millions out of poverty, while also positioning itself as a key player in global supply chains. China's massive population of over 1.4 billion people gives it a significant labor force and consumer base. Although China is facing its own demographic challenges, including an aging population, its economic reforms and focus on innovation help mitigate the impact for now. The rapid expansion of China's middle class has driven domestic consumption and created a powerful internal market that attracts global businesses and investment. Russia's diplomatic position has been weakened by its increasing isolation from the West due to its foreign policy, particularly its actions in Ukraine. Russia has sought alliances with non-Western powers like China, India, and Iran, but it lacks the broad diplomatic reach that China enjoys. Influence in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Russia's influence remains strongest in regions like Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and parts of the Middle East, where it uses a mix of military force, energy diplomacy, and political alliances. However, this is more limited compared to China's global diplomatic reach.